Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and a new series joins the Marvel line. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler. The series that's adding itself to the Marvel line this time is finally Droids, based on Droids, The Adventures of R2-D2 and C-3PO on television, the cartoon series. The cartoon series of Droids premiered alongside Ewoks in September of '85 on ABC. They were airing back to back. It's a series that had these individual, basically half-hour episodes with commercials, so about 20 minutes actually, that became broader story arcs. It only lasted one season, ending in November of 1985. So at this point in our reading of the Star Wars materials, the series is over, with the exception of a July 1986 television special, which has not aired at this point, entitled The Great Heap. Now, it's the same series that nowadays, in cartoon form, you can't find as individual episodes unless they're bootlegs. There just aren't any official releases of them, but there were some by J2 Communications. Most notably, though, we have the Animated Classics VHS release for Droids, the Pirates, and the Prince. One story arc essentially combined together into a feature-length film. Then they took another one and added it to that one on DVD for Animated Adventures Droids double feature, The Pirates and the Prince, and Treasure of the Hidden Planet. But these are taking place around 15 years prior to the events of A New Hope, about 4 years after Revenge of the Sith. There will eventually be another series of Droids comics from Dark Horse, actually several of them. We have the original series, the Kalarba Adventures, we have the one with a Season of Revolt and Rebellion and such, which is sort of a second series, and we wind up having a one-shot called the Protocol Offensive, all of which kind of tie together and take place around 5.5 years before the Battle of Yavin. In between, in a gap of unspecified specificity, basically just one big gap with no specifics as to when specific issues take place, of 10 years before the Battle of Yavin and 6 years before the Battle of Yavin, so that it's at least 5 years after the cartoons and not going to be running into the Dark Horse stuff, we get this Star Comics, Marvel Comics, Kitty imprint series called simply Droids, the first Star Wars Droids comic book series. We're dealing right now with issue number 1 of that series, entitled The Destroyer. This was released in December of 1985, so it's being released actually the month after the cartoon series' first season. Its only real season ended, and yet a few months before we'd wind up seeing The Great Heap capping it off on television. At this point, the Ewok series has been going on since January of '85, so they've got quite a few issues down. Droids is going to be a much shorter series with only 8 issues here. On the cover of issue number 1, we have, "Now we've done it, R2-D2. Those metal monsters may destroy this entire planet, and us along with it." And R2, wee-woo! And you notice there R2 doesn't have a lot of blue on him. There really isn't a lot of blue on R2-D2 the way that he's handled in this comic series. So it's a little odd for him to be R2-D2. But they tell us it's the first thrilling issue. We shall be the judge of that, sirs. It is, however, a story written by Dave Manak, the same man who's been writing the Ewok series, and John Romita, a big name in comics at the time as the penciler. You can find this these days in the pages of Star Wars Omnibus, Droids, and Ewoks. This includes all of the Star Comics Droids and Ewoks comics, plus the Golden Books, Star Wars and Ewok Adventure coloring book, which is an oddity there from the 90s that just happened to be tossed in here. Just seems a little bizarre that it was, but I guess it's because it's not a Dark Horse Droids comic, which got its own omnibus quite a bit earlier. So if I say, it's another series of tales that usually are told in multiple parts, but whereas the Ewoks comic stories tend to be in 3 pieces, these tend to be in 2. So we have The Destroyer, which is part 1, and the overall story title, and then we have The Showdown, which is part 2. At this point, R2-D2 and C-3PO are in search of new masters. They are working for the Intergalactic Droid Agency, which is basically finding them masters and sending them out. And they're going to go through a lot of masters here. They already went through several masters back in the cartoon series, and of course we saw, Anakin building him. Eventually it becomes C-3PO going to Padme, R2 going to Anakin, etc., etc. So, we've seen a little bit of their sordid history in video form up to this point. At this point, they lack a master, and they are trying to find one, so they are sent to a new planet. They're sent to the planet Dodz, D-O-D-Z, to meet with their new master, Lot Kemp, the Crystal Merchant. Only when they show up, turns out, it's all been blasted all to heck, and their master is not around. They wind up finding a young child, however, here, who is able to sort of tell them what the heck is going on. At this point, the master they were supposed to go to has escaped thanks to this big guy, right? This Cug going around with a destroyer droid and wiping out everything, kind of dominating the area. He's the governor of the planet here, and he's basically terrorizing his own citizens for mainly amusement and intimidation and such. But this kid has managed to escape, and he's willing to take on C-3PO and R2-D2 for a time as essentially a new master. The kid's name is Jost Elon, Jostellon, and apparently flies a mean speeder. Basically, at this point, Cug is planning on going to an upcoming council meeting and forcing them to raise taxes and such by using this killer droid of his to basically intimidate them, as expected here. As for young Jost, he has his own little workshop here with all kinds of stuff he's managed to salvage, but he's all on his own because his family was some of the first victims of Cug's tyranny. He winds up uncovering this big old box. It says X1 on it. They're not quite sure what this is, except it turns out this is a Ranger X1 protector defense robot, defense droid. They are able to essentially find out that it has no power. R2-D2 blasts it with a little bit of energy of his own, just enough to make it transform into the actual X1, except it really can't do much of anything at this point. Despite the council saying, no, we've got to give in, there's nothing we can do here, that X1's not going to do you any good because it doesn't even work, please kid, don't try anything, the kid, of course, tries something. Whenever Cug shows up, he shows up with his X1, which briefly does battle with that big destroyer droid that Cug has brought with him. Unfortunately, the X1 runs out of power, and R2-D2 manages to save the day by basically firing a couple of power cables into each of them, drawing power from the destroyer and putting it into the X1, so the X1 can then destroy the destroyer droid. Except, as he does so, there's this big explosion, and now there's a destroyer gone, but R2-D2 is severely damaged in the process. The council turns on Cug. Jost is now a hero. The X1 will now be its guardian, and now it's time for the droids to take off because R2-D2 has some serious microsynapse damage and we just can't repair him here. So they get aboard a ship and take off to go find someone who can possibly repair R2-D2. And believe it or not, that actually will connect to the next issue as its setup story. Actual continuity in a Star comic series. Broadly speaking, I mean, this is, I don't know. I guess it's sort of a step up from the Ewok stuff because it feels more Star Wars because we do have C-3PO and R2-D2 here. The Ewoks kind of felt more Care Bears-ish in their cartoon and comic interpretations here. But it's kind of odd to think of these two droids basically bouncing around the galaxy, always searching for new masters and kind of running into them temporarily, and then there's some circumstance that sends them on their way again. I mean, I guess it makes sense for them to be very well-traveled and such, based on some of the adventures, and, with all we've been through that C-3PO says in A New Hope and whatnot, just seems a little bit odd. The characters are drawn very much like, say, Richie Rich or any of those little Archie-style comics and whatnot. The governor there is very much a classic cartoon-style goofy villain as opposed to someone who looks very serious as an alien figure here. But it does make for a decent little tale. Tyranny cannot win. Tyrants cannot prosper off the backs of the people. They will rise up, etc., etc. For a kid's comic, I think this turned out fairly well. And I think that the two-part format doesn't suffer compared to, say, the three-part format of the Ewok stuff, because really it all reads as one story anyway. Not really sure why you need those separate story titles in there, except maybe to keep younger readers interested, thinking as they're reading the next part of an ongoing tale or something. But is this story here, Star Wars, Droids, The Destroyer, an essential read? Unfortunately, the answer is no. There'll be little that's actually essential about the Droid series, just like there's little essential about the Ewoks series. A decent little read for kids, an okay read for adults, but quite goofy, but otherwise not something I expect people to really be racing out to try to find unless they're simply collectors. With that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers.